So I realised that since I started making YouTube videos, almost every video that I've done so far has been a gear review or about gear, and what I haven't really talked about is what I use the gear for, which is actually taking photographs. So what I want to do is make a video about taking images from the planning stage through to the capturing stage and then finishing off with the post-processing at the end. So right now I'm here in the Italian Dolomites, and tonight I'm hoping to photograph this peak here, Civetta, and another peak over there maybe, Pelmo, just as the sun sets in about an hour and a half. Now, conditions look pretty good. You can see there's some clouds in the sky. You can see that the sun's over there. Hopefully it's going to drop into a gap beneath the clouds and paint the face of this mountain, because there will be much more over there when we get to the top, in lovely golden light. And also hopefully there'll be some colour on the bottom of the clouds. But you never know, it's landscape photography and the weather does whatever the weather wants to do. Now it's about a 3-kilometre walk that way and a 300-metre ascent, so it's going to take about 45 minutes to get to the top. And hopefully by the time we're there and by the time the sun starts to set, we'll be in luck and we'll get a good image. So for me, all landscape images start at the planning stage. I never really turn up at a location not knowing what to expect. So what I'll do is I'll look at things like Google Maps, I'll do some research, look at Google Earth, try to find what locations interest me. But the best thing to do is to get an actual high definition map, a walking map, something like that, an ordnance survey, something that gives you a lot of detail about the location and the landscape that you're going to be walking in. Because Google Maps is great, it gives you a really good idea of what it's going to be like, but what it never seems to show you is the terrain. Now a really good map will have contour lines on it, so you can see how far you're going to have to climb, how much, so you can have a guess of how long it's going to take you to get there, and also it tells you what kind of trails that you can expect to be walking on. So this is Civetta. As you can see, it's an absolutely beautiful mountain, and I'm getting fantastic light at the moment with the sun coming in and making these incredible beams here. And just over to the east there's Pelmo. Now, I really wanted to come to this location because I've been around the Dolomites for about 2 weeks now, and I've shot some of the really iconic locations like Tirchim, like Crodo del Lago, Seceda, but this is a place that I've not seen that many images of, and it's nice to come somewhere that you've not seen millions of photographs of and see it with fresh images. Now I actually realized last night, because this is my second night here, that I can't shoot the two locations at peak light on the same night because they're about 8 minutes apart. I thought they were closer when I was looking at the map, made a bit of a mistake there. So I shot this location last night and managed to get some excellent images of it, but as you can see the light's fantastic, so I've got to shoot it again now. And then I'm going to go off to Pelmo, which is a little bit over there, and shoot that in the last light of day when hopefully I'm going to get some lovely colour in the sky. And from the way the sky is now, I'm quite hopeful that that's going to happen. So in terms of composition, what I want to do is I'm going to have to shoot wide here. I'm shooting at about 15mm, which is extremely wide angle, because I want to get the entire face of the mountain as it's picked out by the last light. But I also want to make sure I get in the lake in the bottom right, and also obviously the light, which is doing some beautiful things where the sun's setting. But I have to be very careful of the edge of the frame. You can see in the bottom left there are some trees on the slope, there's a bit of the fence and this grass, and I want to try to remove all that. But if I go too far to the right, I start to get this tree that I'm standing next to. So it's basically going to be playing around trying to get the exact correct elevation, zoom in a tiny bit. I think I can go a little bit wider than that, and I think that's about it there. Just there, lock off the tripod, and yep, I think that'll do. Now at the moment it's a little bit too bright, the sun's still a little bit too strong to be taking images because I've got quite a lot of the very bright part in the sky on the right. You can see it's really burning out over here. So what I'm going to do is shoot bracketed exposures here to give myself a really wide dynamic range to make sure I capture all of the detail in the shadows with an overexposed by about 2 stops bracket, 1 at 0, and then also I'm going to shoot about 2 stops below exposure, 2 stops down, to try to make sure I capture all of the detail in the sky. So this here is Mount Pelmo. It's the other location that I want to shoot. Now the thing about shooting mountains is higher is always better. You can get good shots of mountains from down in the valley, particularly if you're lucky enough to get some sort of some foreground or a reflection in a lake or a river or something like that. But the reality of photographing in mountains is the higher you go, the better the view is, because you can kind of start to see them much more in context. You can see the peaks behind receding away this direction over there as well, and it's just always, you get a much more I don't know, awe-inspiring view when you get a little bit higher, because one of the things that I found about mountains is that while it's not too difficult to take good photographs in the mountains, you can never really do them justice because they're just such majestic things. I mean, this here rises to about 3,000 meters high. I'm standing a little bit just over 2,000 meters, and it's just magnificent being here. So hopefully I can make some kind of image that does some sort of justice to this scene with this light. Now what I'm going to try to do here is to shoot in a kind of panorama, because I'm not really interested in the foreground. This is actually the top of a ski slope. It's usually covered in snow in the winter and people are skiing down it, but that's right now it's just basically bare grass and it's not particularly interesting. So what I'm going to shoot here is just basically the panorama across the horizon, removing the foreground, and the best way to do that is to shoot a little bit longer, so not wide angle, and then do a panorama basically across the sky, giving me a sort of letterbox image where we can see these different peaks, the different interplay of light and shadow on the peaks and on the trees and the landscape in front of that. So the two most important things to remember when you're shooting a panorama, the first is to always make sure you've got a significant overlap between one image and the next. So something like a third. So here, there, and maybe there. That should be enough. And the other thing is to always shoot in manual exposure, because if you don't, there's a chance that the camera, the automatic exposure on the camera, is going to change between shots. So basically measure your exposure across each shot and find something that works. And if you find that basically you don't have enough dynamic range, then just shoot it as a bracket. Bracket the exposures and shoot 1, 2, 3 images in each for each pane of the panorama, but never ever use auto exposure, because what that's going to do is if you're shooting where it's brighter there, it's going to lower the exposure and you'll be and the image will be darker, and if you're shooting an image over here where it's much darker and there's not as much light, you're going to have a brighter exposure. So always manual exposure. So I'm back in Portugal and I've imported all of the photos onto my computer, and one of the questions that I guess asked a lot in emails and on previous YouTube videos that I've made is about my image processing workflow. So what I'm going to do is show you that now. Now, on the evening when I made this video, I actually shot 3 images. There was the one of Civetta, of the peak, of the light beams, there was the one of Pelmo, the panorama, and then I took another one a little bit later on after the sun had gone down. But it would take me too long to process all 3 of those images, so I'm just going to focus on one, because basically the processing that I use, the techniques that I use pretty much the same thing on almost every image. So this is pretty indicative of how I process my images. Okay, now let's have a look at processing the images. Now normally I'll spend up to about half an hour to process an image, but I don't want this video to get too long, so I'm going to do this quick and dirty and try to get through the processing as quickly as possible. So this is the first image taken at Civetta with those wonderful light beams, and as I said at the time, I bracketed it. So this is the base exposure, this is the overexposed, it's 2 stops above the base exposure, and this is the underexposed version, which makes sure I've got all the detail in the highlights, which is 2 stops below the base exposure. So if I look at the base exposure, it's actually, the dynamic range is really quite good though. I've got most of it, the highlights aren't clipping too much, and the shadows, they are a little bit crushed, but there's probably most of the information there. And at a push I could probably just use this to get all the information, but I'm going to blend it anyway because that's going to give me a little bit more latitude. So I select the 3 images, right click, and then choose photo merge and HDR. And what this does in Lightroom is it blends those 3 images together, so I get all of the shadow information that I got from the overexposed version and all of the highlight information that I got from the underexposed versions, sort of put into one image, which gives me a lot more data and a lot more information to play with. Now ignore the preview there, it does look horrible, it looks like the worst kind of HDR, but it doesn't matter, the final version isn't going to look like that. So we press OK, and what's going to happen is it's going to create a DNG file which will appear here. Now there we go. Now Lightroom's already applied some some changes to that. Just let me reset everything there. And what you'll notice is that the finished merged HDR version looks exactly the same as the base raw exposure. But the difference is that the HDR, the blended version, has got a lot more information in it, particularly in the shadows and the highlights, because I've blended those other two images into that. So what it means is I've got a lot more latitude over here where I want to play with the highlights, and down here with the shadows. So what do I want to do with this image? Well, what I really want to bring out are these light beams here coming through the mountain, and I want to bring out this light on the cliff here. And what I need to be wary of to control is the brightness, particularly at the bottom of the clouds and at the edge here, and the shadows along the bottom. So I'm going to be working on separate parts of the image using things like the gradient tool. So first I'll bring in a gradient here just to work on the sky, because I want to deal with the highlights in the clouds, but I don't want to have too much effect on the light beams here. So if I get this green, the green mask shows me basically what's going to be affected. I'll put it about there like that. And what I'll do now is pull down those highlights just a little bit. If I go too far, it starts to look a little bit false, just a little bit there. It is very bright, so it's natural to have bright highlights. I'll pull down on the whites a little bit as well, and a little bit of the exposure. No, actually I'll leave the exposure because that's darkening the sky, which I don't want to do. Yeah, just the highlights a little bit darker there. And what I'm also going to do is pull down the blacks a little bit, just to make the blacks on the bottom of the clouds just a little bit darker. And I'm going to increase the color temperature because it's very blue, just to make that light a little bit warmer. So I just put in a little bit of yellow there, and that just makes the light disappearing on these clouds just a tiny bit warmer, something like that. All right, now I'm going to work on the bottom part of the image with another gradient. So we'll just pull this one up here to about there now. That's affecting that part of the image. Now what I'm going to do here is just pull the shadows out a tiny bit, not too much, because I don't want it really bright like that, it's going to look false. And I want to make sure I keep this contrast here with the lights hitting the side of the slope. So I just want to be able to see some of the detail, but not too much. And now I'm also going to push out the highlights here, because I want to brighten up the lake and I want to brighten up these beams. So if I push the highlights up, that just makes the light beams here and the contrast here a little bit on the slope. I think we'll make the shadows a little bit, tiny bit darker. And again, I'm going to increase the color temperature just to put a little bit of warmth into that light. And now I just want to really bring out this here. So what I'm going to use is an ellipsis tool here, which I can drop just over the light beams, rotate it a little bit up, just rotate it a little bit, and put that where it's just touching the light beams, play around with the shape. You can see that it's already got a default setting, and that's lowering the exposure, which I don't want. At the moment, just playing around with positioning. Something like that. It's not going to touch the sky or the highlights here, and I'm going to really push out the highlights there to brighten that up, and the whites, and a tiny bit of exposure, not too much because I don't want to brighten up the shadows as well. It'll start to look natural. And again, just put in a little bit of warmth, put in a little bit of color temperature like that. Now that's basically all I'm going to do in Lightroom. I principally use Lightroom just for things like this, to get the light and the exposure exactly how I want it. But I don't do any contrast or color work in Lightroom. That's all going to be done in Photoshop. So now what I do, right click, edit in Photoshop, and what that's going to do is open this image into Photoshop, where I can basically play with layers and build up the different adjustments that I want to make on the image with layers, just to get the final working with the contrast and maybe a tiny little bit of color work. Now, one of the things that I basically use in all of my work for contrast is luminosity masks. You can see this action panel here is the Tony Kuiper action panel, which is he's a photographer who developed the tool of luminosity masks, which is basically a way of applying changes to particular parts of the image which are decided by the tonal value there. So what I can do is apply changes just to the dark parts of the image, or just to the light parts of the image, or just to the midtones of the image. Now what I usually would do is work first with the midtones, because when I apply changes to the midtones, so if I select this here, what this is going to do is gives me a curves adjustment layer, which will only affect the midtones. This won't affect the highlights too much or the shadows, but what it will do is give the midtones, the grays in the middle of the histogram, it will give them a little bit of a punch. You can see there, it gives the sky a little bit of a punch, brings out a little bit of detail here, and it's not really, it's pushing the highlights a little bit over the edge, but I'm not too concerned about that at the moment. I might come back and do some more work on those in a second. I might just have a look at slightly darker midtones. So I'm going to choose now a levels layer and just look at the slightly darker range of them. Actually, no, I don't think I'm going to use that, so I'll just drag that and get rid of it. I'm going to have a look at the sky as well. So I'm going to choose a light curves adjustment layer. So if I press this, I can see here, you can see where it's white. The area that's white is where anything that I do in this curves adjustment layer will just affect the areas that are white and a little bit the gray, but anything that's black is just going to be masked out. So if I pull down this curve, it's just going to affect, you can see they're just the highlights, so it's just bringing them down a little bit, and that'll probably do, I think. Leave it like that. Now that's what I'm going to use with the luminosity masks. Now what I'm going to do is have a look at color and a little bit more contrast using Nik Color Effects Pro. So I compress that into another layer, flatten it into another layer, and then filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro, and that's going to open that piece of software as a plugin into Photoshop. Now you can get this also as a plugin for Lightroom, but I like to use it in Photoshop because I like to do the adjustments just on a layer, because again I can turn that layer on or off. I can use the opacity slider to choose how strong the adjustment's going to be. In Lightroom I can't really do that so much because I don't have layers, so it works much better for me as a Photoshop plugin. Now there are loads of different, you can see them all here on the left. These are all the different adjustment filters that you get in Color Effects Pro, and there's just so many, but I only use a very tiny proportion of them. These are the ones that I've got in my favorites, but of these it's really just 2 or 3 that I tend to use. One of them is the skylight filter, which generally gives you a little bit of warmth, puts a little bit of pink and orange. It's great for sunsets, but also for a shot like this, it's just going to bring out a little bit more warmth and orange into the highlights. Now I can press this here and add another filter, but again, as I was saying, I like to make each adjustment on a separate layer, so I'm just going to save that, and what that will do is save it onto a layer here, and then I'm going to do the same again with a different adjustment filter. So let's just wait for that to save. It takes a while. Okay, now it's saved, and you can see the effect there. It's actually really quite subtle, the change that I made. So again, let's make another mask, another layer, and open that again in Color Effects Pro. This time I'm going to use the Pro Contrast tool. Now this has a similar effect to just working with the midtones. It's if I just use the dynamic contrast slider here, I don't touch the other two, what that's going to do is just work on the midtones. It's not going to touch the highlights. You can see that it doesn't do anything to the highlights, and neither the dark shadows, but you can see it's making a difference down here in the grassy and in the trees, the forest on the side of the slope. It just gives it a little bit more pop, brings out the detail a little bit. So yeah, that'll do. Just save that. Okay, and I would say that's pretty much finished. Now the only thing that I need to do now is worry a little bit about this little bit at the bottom of the edge here, where the grass on the bank came into the frame, and I'm going to crop off a little bit from the top, but I'll do that back in Lightroom. So normally I wouldn't flatten the image. Normally I'd save the image as a PSD file, because that means that I can get back, I can add and take away any of these adjustments any time that I want, but just it'll save a lot faster if I flatten it and then save it, and it will open up it will have saved back here in Lightroom. Now I tend to do things like cropping always right at the end in Lightroom, because then if I change my mind about the crop, I can just remove the crop from the saved Lightroom file and just basically play around with it without having to go through all the steps of re-editing it a little bit. So I just select the crop tool here, custom, and do the padlock. Now the first thing is just to push up the bottom a little bit, just to get rid of that stuff that was encroaching in the bottom of the frame. I'm also going to pull it down a little bit, make it more of a panorama shot. And what this is going to do is, if there's a little bit less sky, because there isn't really a lot happening in that top left corner of the frame, this actually also has the effect of making the peak seem taller, because it's filling up much more of the frame. There's less sky above it, which just gives the idea of this cliff face here, makes it feel a little bit bigger. So I'll just crop it at that. And that probably is everything with that image. It's quite nice. It was a lovely scene. It really brings out as you can see, I've really brought out the light beams coming in from the side. You can just see from the histogram that we're right at the edge of the highlights, but not particularly blown out. I can just pull those back a little bit more, but it doesn't really need it. And that's it, really. That's everything from that image. So I think that's everything. I hope it's been useful. I hope it's been interesting. If there's anything you're not sure about, anything that you'd like to know, drop me a question in the comments below, and I'll make sure I get back to you. And once again, thanks for watching, and take care.